I was 23 when I drove to my parents' house that Thursday afternoon, thinking we'd finally put the tension behind us. I pictured us sitting at the kitchen table where I'd done my homework as a child, hashing out whatever words had built a wall between us. The autumn air was sharp when I stepped onto the porch, and I told myself the cold I felt was just the weather, not the moment waiting on the other side of the door. Margaret opened it first. She stood in the frame as if her hand was the only thing keeping the house upright. Richard appeared a step behind her, his arms crossed. Neither of them smiled. "I tried anyway. I thought we could talk," I said, forcing a brightness I didn't feel. Margaret's eyes flicked over my face. Unreadable. "Angelina, it's better if you don't come here anymore." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. "What do you mean?" Richard answered, his voice flat. "You're not welcome here. Not now, not again. You need to learn to live on your own." It landed like a command, not advice. I stood frozen the familiar hallway just beyond their shoulders, the smell of polished wood seeping out toward me. I wanted to step inside to insist this was still my home, but Margaret's hand tightened on the door. "You'll figure it out," she added almost gently, as though exile could be softened. The words hollowed me out. I was 23, still piecing together who I was supposed to be. And suddenly, the two people who had always defined home were shutting me out of it. They didn't slam the door. They just closed it steady and final until the only sound left was the faint click of the lock sliding into place. I stood on the porch a moment longer, my breath clouding in the November air, before walking back to my car. The steering wheel felt cold beneath my hands as I started the engine, already wondering how I was supposed to build a life from nothing. The apartment I found was wedged above a strip of shops, the kind of place most people passed without noticing. The rent was low, which was all that mattered. The carpet was worn thin in the hallway, the walls stained with the ghosts of tenants before me. And at night, the neon diner sign across the alley buzzed through my one small window. Still, it was mine. I carried in 2 boxes and a sewing machine that had once been a side hobby. Now it was my only anchor. I set it up on the rickety kitchen table and stared at it as though it could tell me what came next. My first jobs were scraps hemming a neighbor's trousers, patching a jacket sleeve. The payments were crumpled bills coins pressed into my palm, but I held on to them like treasure. I cut corners wherever I could. I stopped buying coffee, cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror, learned to stretch a single bag of groceries through the week. Every cent I didn't spend went into an old glass jar I tucked into the back of the closet. At first it was pathetic, just loose change rattling against glass, but it gave me something solid to measure against the emptiness I felt everywhere else. Nights were the hardest. I would sit on the edge of the bed scrolling through old text messages from my mother. Most of them were ordinary reminders, small updates, even jokes. But now they read like relics from a language I no longer spoke. I searched for warmth between the lines, something that would tell me this exile was temporary. But the silence on my phone made it clear I wasn't going back. So I worked stitched saved and reminded myself that survival had to be enough for now. What I didn't know then was that the jar would become more than coins. It would become proof I could create something lasting even without the people who told me I couldn't. The jar in the back of my closet became my quiet secret. At first, it held only nickels and dimes, but over time the weight of it grew. Every job I took on curtains for a neighbor's new apartment, repairing a winter coat for a coworker, sewing a child's Halloween costume ended with coins or bills folded into my hand. Each one went straight into the jar. It wasn't much, not enough for anyone else to notice, but for me, it was proof that forward motion was possible. Word spread slowly. A friend of a friend needed a bridesmaid dress altered. A man from down the block wanted custom drapes for his living room. With every stitch, I felt less like I was treading water and more like I was building something tangible. The hum of the machine at night filled the silence that used to echo through my apartment. And for the first time since being shut out, I began to believe I might carve a life without my parents' approval. Still, the wound wasn't gone. One Saturday morning at the farmer's market, I saw them across the street. Margaret carried a tote bag of fresh produce. Richard walked beside her, and they looked unchanged, as if the years had passed without consequence. I froze, half expecting them to glance my way, to at least acknowledge I existed. They didn't. Their eyes slid past me as though I was a stranger. I stood there clutching a bag of fabric scraps I'd bartered for heat rising in my chest. I wanted to call out to prove I was still here, still standing. Instead, I turned back toward my apartment, the jar waiting in the closet like a silent reminder. Every coin I dropped in that glass didn't just mark survival, it marked distance. Each small clink was a boundary I was learning to set, a way of saying to myself, they may never see me, but I see what I'm building. And the day came when the jar was heavy enough to make me wonder what might come next. By the time I turned 25, the jar in my closet had grown too heavy to lift without both hands. I emptied it one night, spreading the coins and bills across the floor in neat stacks. It wasn't much by most standards, but it was enough for a down payment on something I could call mine. The house I found sat on the edge of town, its siding chipped and the yard overgrown with weeds. Most people saw a burden. I saw a beginning. Signing the papers felt surreal. No cosigner, no family safety net, just my name alone. When I walked into the empty living room, the air smelled of dust and neglect. But beneath it, I could sense possibility. Friends shook their heads when I told them. It's a money pit, one said. You'll regret it. But regret was what I already lived with. I needed something that belonged to me, even if it came with broken floorboards and peeling paint. I started with the smallest things. A fresh coat of paint in the kitchen. Curtains I sewed myself. Roses planted by the front steps, their roots gripping the soil, I turned with blistered hands. Every improvement was slow, often done late at night after finishing sewing jobs to keep up with bills. But each change stitched the house a little closer to being mine. There were moments I nearly gave in to doubt when the plumbing failed, when I pulled back old carpet to find warped wood beneath. I wondered if I'd taken on more than I could manage. But each problem I solved gave me back a piece of the confidence I thought I'd lost. Months passed, and the house began to reflect not just effort, but resilience. The walls no longer echoed with emptiness. They carried the sound of my sewing machine, the radio playing softly as I worked the hum of a life being built from nothing. I would sometimes pause in the doorway, looking out at the roses beginning to bloom, and think, this is what survival has turned into. Not just making it through the day, but creating a place where no one can tell me I don't belong. And it was in that moment of fragile triumph that the phone call I never expected finally came. 5 years passed before their voices found their way back into my life. I was in the garden that afternoon, kneeling in the dirt with my hands covered in soil, pressing bulbs into the earth. The roses I had planted by the steps were taller now, their buds swelling with color. That was when my phone lit up on the porch rail. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Mom. For a moment, I just stared, half convinced it was a mistake. My thumb hovered before I finally swiped to answer. Hello? My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Angelina Margaret said, her tone unusually soft, almost syrupy. It's been so long. How have you been? Behind her words, I caught the faint murmur of my father like he was feeding her lines. I brushed dirt from my palms onto my jeans. I've been fine, I answered carefully. She hesitated before continuing. Your father and I have had a difficult stretch. His hours were cut back and the mortgage. She trailed off with a sigh, then added, We've been talking and thought maybe we could stay with you for a while, just until we get back on our feet. The air seemed to thicken around me. I stood staring at the roses I had nursed from bare sticks into life. My chest tightened with something I couldn't name. Part of me wanted to believe this was a step toward reconciliation, the part of me that still replayed old text messages late at night. But another part remembered the door closing, the finality in my father's voice when he told me I wasn't welcome. I pressed the phone harder against my ear. That's unexpected, I said slowly. Margaret rushed to fill the silence. It would be temporary. Of course we'd contribute to the bills. Family should be there for each other. Her words landed with a weight that felt familiar, like a key turning in a lock I didn't ask for. I agreed to think about it, though my gut was already tight with unease. We ended the call politely, almost warmly, but as I set the phone down, my hands trembled in the quiet. That night, I couldn't sleep because beneath the sweetness of her tone, I heard something else entirely, desperation, and I needed to know what it was hiding. The night after the call, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone, replaying every word. Part of me wanted to believe my parents simply needed help, that maybe this was the universe's way of mending what had been broken. But the unease in my stomach wouldn't let me rest. Their voices had been too polished, too careful. The next morning, I dialed Sarah. She'd been a steady presence through my hardest years, a friend who didn't ask for more than I could give. When I explained, her response was calm but firm. Let me look into it just in case. 2 days later, I sat across from her in her office, the smell of burnt coffee lingering between stacks of paper. She slid a thin folder across the desk. You should see this. Inside were copies of court filings, 2 eviction notices filed within the past year, credit card debt stretching past limits, small claims from neighbors and acquaintances who had lent money and never seen it back. My throat tightened as I scanned the pages. But what stopped me cold was the last sheet, a credit application. My father's neat handwriting filled the boxes, and in the space-marked reference my own name appeared. I never agreed to this, I whispered. I know, Sarah said gently, but he used you to look stable. It's a pattern, Angelina. They're drowning and they're reaching for anything that floats. I closed the folder slowly, my hands trembling against the cardboard edges. A part of me wanted to believe desperation had driven them to it, that fear had twisted them into people I barely recognized. But the larger part knew better. This wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't even about family. It was about convenience. I walked out of Sarah's office, clutching the folder, the papers inside, rattling like evidence for a trial that hadn't yet begun. And by the time I reached my car, I knew I had to see just how far they were willing to go. I waited 2 days before calling long enough for my nerves to settle, long enough to rehearse the words. The folder from Sarah sat open on the table beside me, its pages like silent witnesses. When Margaret answered, her voice was bright, almost relieved. Angelina. I was hoping to hear from you, she said. I forced a tremor into my tone. I wish I had better news. The repairs on the house cost more than I planned, and a client backed out on a big order. Honestly, I don't know how I'll cover the bills this month. If things get worse, I might even have to sell. The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Then Margaret's voice changed, the syrup gone. Oh, well, maybe us moving in isn't the best idea right now. We wouldn't want to add to your stress. I waited, hoping for some hint of comfort, some suggestion that my well-being mattered beyond what I could provide. None came. Instead, my father's voice cut in firm and unsympathetic. We can't attach ourselves to instability. We've got our own issues to manage. The words sank like stones. I swallowed hard, letting them echo before answering softly. I understand. Margaret rushed to soften the edges. It's just bad timing, dear. Maybe later when things are steadier. But steadier meant useful. I could hear it as clearly as if she'd said the word. Their interest in me wasn't rooted in love or reconciliation. It was rooted in what I could offer, the stability they lacked. We ended the call politely, Margaret adding a quick love you that rang hollow in my ear. I stared at the phone after hanging up the screen, already dark, and felt something inside me settle into clarity. They hadn't come back for me. They had come back for what I had built. And if they thought I would hand it over so easily, they were about to learn how wrong they were. They came on a Sunday afternoon without calling first. I saw their car pull into the driveway, the sight of it tugging at old memories I had tried to bury. By the time I opened the door, Margaret was already smiling too brightly, Richard standing just behind her with a folder tucked under his arm. We've been thinking things through. Margaret began, her tone warm but rehearsed. This arrangement could work for all of us. We move and help with the upkeep, and then together we put the house on the market. Prices are excellent right now. You'd get cash in hand. We'd get a fresh start. Everyone benefits. Richard stepped forward, his eyes sweeping past me into the hallway, as if measuring what would soon be his. It's the practical choice, he added. I held their gaze, steady and quiet, before stepping aside just enough to reach for the folder waiting on my entry table. Without a word, I placed it between us and flipped it open. Eviction filings, debt notices, the credit application with my name scribbled as a reference. Margaret's smile faltered. Richard's jaw tightened. I know, I said calmly. I know exactly why you're here, and it isn't because you miss me. Richard bristled. You've been digging into our lives. I looked for the truth, I replied evenly. Because you stopped offering it. Margaret tried a softer key. We just want to start over to be close again. I shook my head. No, this house isn't your escape. It's my life. I built it inch by inch, and I won't sell my peace to cover your mistakes. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the wind moving through the roses outside. Finally, I stepped back into the doorway and let my hand rest against the frame. If you want help finding resources, I'll send you a list. But if you want my house, the answer is no. I closed the door firmly, the echo reminding me of another door closed years before, but this time it was mine to shut. When the latch clicked, I leaned my forehead against the door and let the silence sink in. For a moment, the house felt too still, as if the air itself was waiting for me to decide what came next. My chest ached, not with the sharp sting of rejection I'd once known, but with something heavier, a grief for all the years I had wasted trying to earn what was never going to be given. Tears came then, sudden and hot. They weren't for Margaret or Richard. Not anymore. They were for the younger version of me who had stood outside their house 5 years ago, believing her worth could be erased with a single closed door. I cried for the time lost to doubt, for the nights spent scrolling through old messages, hoping silence might break into forgiveness. When the tears finally slowed, I wiped my face with the heel of my hand and drew in a steady breath. Then I reached for the lock, sliding it firmly into place. This time, the sound was not rejection. It was protection. I stepped into the kitchen and filled a small watering can, carrying it out to the garden. The roses by the steps were catching the last light of the afternoon, their petals unfurling in shades of pink and red. I poured water gently over their roots, watching it soak into the soil I had turned with my own hands. The quiet that settled around me was not empty. It was full, grounding, certain. For the first time in years, the weight pressing on my shoulders felt lighter. I straightened the can dangling loosely from my hand and looked at the house behind me. It no longer felt fragile. It felt like mine. 5 years ago, I drove away from my parents' house with nothing but my car keys and a pit in my stomach. I was 23, directionless, and convinced that being cast out meant I had failed. Now at 28, I walk through the rooms of my own home and feel a steadiness that no one can take from me. The silence I once feared has become a kind of companion. It wraps around me when I wake in the mornings and follows me as I work late into the night, steady as the hum of my sewing machine. This house with its patched walls and creaking floors carries my fingerprints in every corner. It may not be perfect, but it is proof. Proof that I could begin again without them. Proof that survival can turn into something stronger. I sometimes imagine what I would do if they knocked again, if they came not with plans or demands, but with honesty. I know I could stand in the doorway and listen, but until that day comes, the lock will hold. Not out of spite, but out of respect for myself, for the life I've built, for the boundaries that keep me whole. Outside, the roses are in full bloom, their petals catching the late sun. I remember planting them as bare sticks, wondering if they would ever take root. They did on their own time, without permission, without approval. So did I. I kneel to pull a weed from the soil, brushing dirt from my hands, and rise to face the house that carries my name alone. The past no longer feels like a weight. It feels like distance, and I have no desire to walk back across. Angelina's journey in the story reveals a profound lesson about self-reliance and the power of setting boundaries. Cast out by her parents at 23, she faced rejection and isolation but refused to let it define her worth. Through relentless effort, stitching, saving, and rebuilding, she transformed a modest jar of coins into a home that symbolized her resilience. The pivotal lesson emerges when her parents return, seeking to exploit her hard-earned stability. By uncovering their ulterior motives and firmly denying their request to move in, Angelina learns that true strength lies in protecting what she has built, not in seeking approval from those who once rejected her. This choice, rooted in self-respect, marks her growth from a young woman craving familial validation to one who recognizes her own value. The roses she nurtures mirror her own rootedness, thriving without external permission. Angelina's story underscores that healing from betrayal comes not from reconciliation, but from creating a life where one's worth is self-defined and boundaries are a form of self-love. The lock she slides into place is not just for her home, but for her heart, safeguarding her future.
The quarterly family meeting was held at Uncle Gerald's estate in Medina, same as always. The mahogany conference table that had belonged to great-grandfather Williams sat in the center of his library, surrounded by 12 leather chairs for the 12 voting members of the Williams Family Investment Fund. I arrived precisely at 2 p.m., carrying my usual manila folder of documents that everyone else assumed contained my part-time job receipts and budgeting worksheets. The other 11 members were already seated, their own folders thick with financial statements, investment reports and business proposals. Sophia. Cousin Marcus called out as I took my seat. Perfect timing. We were just discussing the quarterly returns. The Williams Family Investment Fund had been established by our great-grandfather in 1987 as a way to preserve and grow generational wealth. Each family member contributed a percentage of their income annually, and investment decisions were made by majority vote. Current fund value: approximately $47 million. What made me different from my cousins was that while they contributed their annual salaries and bonuses, I contributed from investment returns that they didn't know existed. My annual contribution to the family fund was $150,000. My actual annual income was closer to $23 million. Before we begin, Uncle Gerald said, settling into his role as fund administrator, I want to address some concerns that have been raised about fund governance. Here we go. Cousin Jennifer leaned forward. We've all been discussing this privately, and we think it's time for some difficult conversations about participation requirements. What kind of requirements? I asked, though I already knew where this was headed. Marcus pulled out a spreadsheet. We've been analyzing contribution ratios relative to voting power, and some patterns are concerning. The Williams Family Fund operated on a one-person, one-vote system regardless of contribution size. Great-grandfather had designed it that way to prevent wealthy family members from dominating decisions. Each of the 12 members had equal voting rights on investment choices. The issue, Cousin Rachel said diplomatically, is that some members contribute significantly more than others, but everyone gets equal say in how the money is invested. Cousin David nodded. For example, Marcus contributed $340,000 this year from his law firm profits. Jennifer put in $280,000 from her medical practice. Rachel contributed $190,000 from her consulting business. And then there's Sophia, Jennifer said, not unkindly but pointedly, who contributed $150,000 from her part-time bookkeeping work. Actually, my contribution came from a single dividend payment from one of my pharmaceutical holdings, but I didn't think this was the moment to clarify that detail. Now, Sophia, Uncle Gerald said carefully, we all appreciate your participation. But we need to be realistic about the optics of equal voting rights when contribution levels vary so dramatically. What are you suggesting? I asked. Marcus cleared his throat. We're suggesting a restructured voting system based on contribution percentages. More skin in the game, more say in investment decisions. That seems fair, I said. The room relaxed slightly. They'd been expecting resistance. However, Rachel continued, we also need to address some concerns about your financial judgment. Why financial judgment? Jennifer opened her own folder. We've been reviewing your voting history over the past 3 years. You consistently vote against our most profitable investments. This was true. I'd voted against their tech stock picks, their real estate ventures and their cryptocurrency investments. Not because the investments were bad, but because I already had significant exposure to those sectors through my personal portfolio and didn't need additional positions through the family fund. For instance, David said, you voted against the Amazon position that returned 34% last year. And you opposed the Tesla investment that's up 67% since we bought it, Marcus added. Plus the Seattle real estate fund that's generated 23% annual returns, Rachel said. Uncle Gerald nodded gravely. Sophia, we love you, but your track record suggests you don't understand modern investment strategies. Maybe traditional investing isn't your strength, Jennifer said gently. There's no shame in that. Not everyone has a head for financial markets. The thing was, I did understand modern investment strategies. I'd been implementing them successfully for 8 years, building a portfolio that had grown from my Stanford MBA graduation gift of $500,000 to my current net worth of approximately $180 million. I'd voted against their Amazon position because I already owned $12 million in Amazon stock through my personal accounts. I'd opposed Tesla because my portfolio included $8 million in Tesla shares plus positions in 3 other EV companies. The Seattle real estate fund overlapped with my existing $23 million commercial real estate portfolio. But explaining this would require revealing the scope of my personal investments, which I'd been deliberately keeping private. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Marcus exchanged glances with the others. We're proposing a new governance structure. Voting rights proportional to contributions, plus a competency requirement for investment committee participation. What kind of competency requirement? Minimum portfolio size, David said. If you're going to vote on investment decisions for a $47 million fund, you should have demonstrated success managing your own assets. How much are we talking about? $2 million minimum, Jennifer said. That's less than 5% of the total fund value. It's a reasonable threshold for serious investors. Uncle Gerald leaned forward sympathetically. Sophia, we know this seems harsh, but we're talking about family wealth preservation. We can't let sentiment override fiduciary responsibility. I understand, I said. The good news, Rachel said brightly, is that you can still benefit from fund returns as a beneficiary. You just wouldn't have voting rights until you meet the portfolio requirements. So I would contribute $150,000 annually but have no say in how it's invested? Think of it as professional money management, Marcus said. You get exposure to institutional quality investments without the responsibility of making complex financial decisions. The room was quiet while I considered this proposal. My 11 cousins and Uncle Gerald waiting to see how I'd react to being voted out of investment decisions due to financial incompetence. Can we put this to a vote? I asked. Are you sure? Jennifer asked. We don't want you to feel pressured. I'm sure. Uncle Gerald called for a formal vote on the restructured governance proposal. All in favor of implementing contribution-based voting rights and portfolio competency requirements? 11 hands went up. Marcus, Jennifer, Rachel, David, Uncle Gerald, and the 6 other cousins whose names I won't bore you with. Everyone except me. All opposed. I raised my hand alone. Motion carries 11-1, Uncle Gerald announced. The new governance structure will take effect at the next quarterly meeting. Congratulations, everyone, I said sincerely. I think this will work out well for all of us. The meeting continued with discussion of new investment opportunities. A biotech startup that Marcus wanted to back. A commercial real estate deal that Jennifer had identified. A cryptocurrency fund that David was enthusiastic about. I listened politely while they debated allocation percentages and risk assessments. Occasionally someone would ask for my thoughts, then remember that my opinion was no longer relevant under the new governance structure. After the meeting, several cousins approached me privately to express concern about the vote. Sophia, I hope you don't take this personally, Jennifer said. It's just business. I understand completely, I replied. You're still family, Marcus added. This doesn't change anything between us. Of course not. Rachel hugged me goodbye. Maybe this will motivate you to focus more on building your own portfolio. Financial independence is so empowering. I drove home to my modest apartment in Fremont, the same one-bedroom place I'd been renting since graduate school. Once inside, I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my laptop to review the Williams Family Investment Fund documentation. The fund had been established with very specific governance provisions written by great-grandfather Williams, who'd been paranoid about family disputes over money. According to the original trust documents, any significant governance changes required unanimous consent from all beneficiaries. What my cousins didn't realize was that their vote to restructure the fund had violated the trust agreement. The new governance structure was legally invalid. But more importantly, they'd overlooked a key provision in great-grandfather's original documents. While the fund operated on democratic voting principles for investment decisions, ultimate control rested with the primary beneficiary, defined as the family member who contributed the largest percentage of fund assets over the fund's lifetime. I opened my secure financial software and pulled up my contribution history. $150,000 annually for the past 8 years, totaling $1.2 million in direct contributions to the family fund. But there was another category of contributions that my cousins weren't aware of. Great-grandfather had included a provision allowing anonymous contributions through third-party investment vehicles. The idea was that family members could contribute additional assets without revealing their wealth to relatives who might become envious or demanding. Over the past 8 years, I'd been making anonymous contributions to the Williams Family Fund through a shell company called Cascade Family Holdings. These contributions totaled $31.7 million, approximately 67% of the fund's current asset base. Under great-grandfather's trust provisions, this made me the controlling beneficiary with authority to dissolve the fund, remove trustees, or override investment decisions. My cousins had just voted to exclude me from fund governance while being completely unaware that I controlled the fund. I opened my encrypted email and sent a message to my attorney. Please review Williams Family Trust governance provisions. Need to understand dissolution procedures. The response came back within 2 hours. Reviewed documents. As controlling beneficiary, you have unilateral authority to dissolve fund and distribute assets. Requires 30-day notice to all beneficiaries. Shall I prepare dissolution papers? I spent the evening thinking about this decision. The rational part of my brain knew that dissolving the fund would hurt innocent family members who'd been counting on those investment returns for their retirement planning. Uncle Gerald had contributed faithfully for 30 years. Several of my cousins had significant portions of their net worth tied up in fund assets. But the emotional part of my brain was tired of being called financially irresponsible by people whose investment success was subsidized by my anonymous contributions. The next morning I called my attorney. Please prepare the dissolution papers, I said. I want to terminate the Williams Family Investment Fund. Understood. The trust provisions require distribution of assets proportional to lifetime contributions. Given your anonymous contribution history, you'll receive approximately 68% of fund assets. How much are we talking about? Based on current valuations, your distribution would be approximately $32 million. The remaining $15 million would be distributed among the other 11 beneficiaries. And their individual distributions? Uncle Gerald would receive about $3.2 million based on his contribution history. The cousins would receive between $800,000 and $1.4 million each, depending on their years of participation. So instead of managing a $47 million fund with professional investment advisory services, my cousins would each be left with individual accounts ranging from $800,000 to $1.4 million. Still significant money, but without the institutional advantages and diversification benefits of the larger fund. What about timing? Dissolution can be effective 30 days after notice is provided. Asset liquidation and distribution would take an additional 60 to 90 days. Please proceed with the paperwork. I'll need written authorization for a decision of this magnitude. You'll have it this afternoon. After I hung up, I drafted the authorization letter and sent it through our secure system. By tomorrow, Uncle Gerald would receive formal notice that the Williams Family Investment Fund was being dissolved by order of the controlling beneficiary. But first I had a phone call to make. I dialed Marcus's direct line at his law firm. Sophia, he answered cheerfully. I was just thinking about you. How are you feeling about yesterday's meeting? I'm feeling good about it, I said. It clarified some things for me. Good. I was worried you might be upset about the vote. Not at all. It got me thinking about my own portfolio development. That's the spirit. Have you given any thought to what you want to focus on? Actually, I wanted to ask you about something. You mentioned yesterday that fund members should have at least $2 million in personal assets to qualify for voting rights. That's right. It's a reasonable threshold for serious investors. I was curious, do anonymous trust contributions count toward that threshold? Anonymous contributions? What do you mean? Well, what if someone had been contributing to the family fund through shell companies or investment vehicles? Would those contributions count toward the portfolio requirement? Marcus laughed. Sophia, that's a very sophisticated question. But anonymous contributions would still count if they could be verified. Why do you ask? Just wondering about the mechanics. The trust documents mention provisions for third-party contributions. You've been reading the trust documents? That's impressive. Most family members never bother with the legal details. Great-grandfather was thorough. I wanted to understand how everything worked. Well, to answer your question, yes, any contributions that could be documented would count toward portfolio requirements. But we're talking about theoretical scenarios. Anonymous contributions would be nearly impossible to verify. Unless the anonymous contributor chose to reveal themselves. I suppose, but why would they? The whole point of anonymity is privacy. Good point, I said. One more question. What happens if it turns out that someone has been contributing much more than the others realized? What do you mean much more? I mean, what if someone's total contributions were larger than everyone else's combined? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Sophia, what exactly are you getting at? I'm getting at the fact that I've been contributing to the Williams Family Fund through Cascade Family Holdings for the past 8 years. Cascade Family Holdings? I've never heard of that. It's one of my investment vehicles. Total contributions, $31.7 million. Sophia, that's not possible. Why isn't it possible? Because you work part-time doing bookkeeping. You can't afford to contribute $31 million to anything. I can afford whatever I want, Marcus. I have a net worth of approximately $180 million. The line went quiet. That's not funny, Sophia. I'm not trying to be funny. I'm trying to explain that your vote yesterday was based on incomplete information. Sophia, you drive a 15-year-old Honda. You live in a studio apartment. I live modestly because I choose to. It keeps me grounded and helps me make better investment decisions. You're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. $180 million to be precise. Built through strategic investments over 8 years since I graduated from Stanford. But you let everyone think. I let you think what you wanted to think. You assumed that because I live simply, I must be financially unsuccessful. Sophia, if this is true, why didn't you ever say anything? Why would I? You all seemed so proud of your investment expertise. I didn't want to diminish your sense of accomplishment. But we just voted you out of the fund. I know. Which is why I'm dissolving it. What? As the controlling beneficiary, I'm exercising my right to dissolve the Williams Family Investment Fund. The papers are being filed this afternoon. Sophia, you can't do that. Actually, I can. Great-grandfather's trust documents are very clear about governance hierarchy. What does that mean for everyone else? It means you'll each receive a distribution based on your lifetime contributions. Uncle Gerald will get about $3.2 million. You and the other cousins will get between $800,000 and $1.4 million each. And you? I'll receive approximately $32 million, since I contributed 68% of the fund's assets. Sophia, please, don't do this. We can fix the governance structure. We can give you voting rights back. Based on what? My financial competency that you questioned yesterday. We were wrong. We didn't have complete information. You had the information you cared about. You knew I lived modestly and worked part-time. You assumed that meant I was financially irresponsible. We made a mistake. You made a judgment about my character based on your assumptions about my bank account. Sophia, please. The fund has been in our family for 37 years. Don't destroy that legacy because of one bad vote. I'm not destroying anything, Marcus. I'm distributing everyone's contributions back to them. You'll all be free to make your own investment decisions without worrying about my financially irresponsible vote. But we'll lose all the advantages of scale. The institutional access, the diversification, the professional management. You'll have your individual portfolios to manage. Isn't that what successful investors prefer? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. How long do we have? 30 days notice, then 60 to 90 days for asset liquidation and distribution. Is there anything we can do to change your mind? You could apologize. I'm apologizing. I'm so sorry. We all are. Are you sorry for voting me out or sorry for discovering I had more money than you thought? Both. I mean, we're sorry for making assumptions. But if I actually had been financially unsuccessful, you'd still think the vote was justified. Marcus didn't answer. That's what I thought, I said. The dissolution papers will be filed this afternoon. Uncle Gerald will receive official notice tomorrow. Sophia, wait. I hung up. Within an hour, my phone was buzzing with calls from other family members. Jennifer, Rachel, David, Uncle Gerald, and various cousins whose names I'd forgotten. All of them had heard from Marcus, all of them wanting to understand what was happening. I let them all go to voicemail. By Thursday morning, the business press would be reporting that a $47 million family investment fund was being dissolved by its controlling beneficiary. By Friday, my cousins would be scrambling to find new investment advisors for their individual distributions. And I would continue living in my modest apartment, driving my old Honda, and working part-time helping small business owners organize their finances. Because despite what my family believed, some things were more important than managing large sums of money effectively. Though I had to admit watching their accounts freeze was going to be satisfying. Just like I'd told my attorney they would be. The Riverside Ballroom had been booked solid for 6 months, but I'd made an exception for what I thought was a genuine family milestone celebration. The reservation was under Martinez's 50th anniversary, 85 guests, and the event coordinator had mentioned it was a golden anniversary celebration that had been planned for over a year. What I hadn't realized was that the Martinez family was my family. I'd been reviewing the evening's events from my office overlooking the main ballroom when I noticed something familiar about the guest of honor. The man standing at the head table raising a toast to 50 years of marriage was my father. My father who hadn't spoken to me in 3 years. My father who had made it clear that his disappointment of a daughter was no longer welcome at family gatherings. My father who was celebrating his anniversary at the event venue I'd owned for the past 4 years. I'd purchased the Riverside Ballroom during the pandemic when the previous owners were facing bankruptcy. The $8.2 million acquisition had been part of my larger strategy to build a hospitality portfolio, and it had proven to be an excellent investment. The venue now generated over $2.3 million annually and had become one of the city's premier event locations. What my family didn't know was that their failed daughter had quietly built a $67 million business empire over the past decade. While they saw me as the family black sheep who'd wasted her potential, I'd been systematically acquiring distressed properties, renovating them, and creating a network of profitable hospitality businesses. The estrangement had started 5 years ago when I'd refused to lend my brother Carlos $50,000 for what turned out to be his third failed restaurant venture. The family had rallied around him, painting me as selfish and unsupportive. When I tried to explain that enabling his poor business decisions wasn't helping him, they'd accused me of being jealous of his entrepreneurial spirit. The final break had come 3 years ago at my cousin Maria's wedding, when Dad had publicly announced that he was tired of making excuses for a daughter who couldn't even afford to help family. I'd left that night and hadn't attended a family event since. Now, watching through my office window as my family celebrated without me at my own venue, I felt a familiar mix of sadness and irony. They'd found the money for an elegant anniversary party at one of the city's most expensive venues, but they'd spent years telling me I needed to be more responsible with money. I was debating whether to simply let the evening proceed without incident when my event coordinator, Jessica, knocked on my office door. "Ms. Martinez, we have a situation in the ballroom." "What kind of situation?" "There's a woman sitting alone at table 12. The other guests are, well, they're being quite cruel to her. Making comments about her appearance, her job, things like that. She looks upset." My stomach dropped. "What kind of comments?" "One man said something about her being too poor to dress properly for family events. Another woman mentioned that she doesn't contribute anything to the family. It's making other guests uncomfortable." I looked through the window and spotted table 12 in the back corner. A woman in a simple black dress sat alone, surrounded by empty chairs. Even from my office, I could see she was trying to remain composed while voices around her grew louder and more critical. It took me a moment to recognize her. Elena, my youngest cousin. She'd always been quiet, working as a teacher while the rest of the family pursued what they considered more prestigious careers. Apparently, she'd become their new target for disappointment. "How long has this been going on?" I asked Jessica. "About 20 minutes. It started when the man at the head table, I think he's the father of the bride and groom." "Groom. Golden anniversary." "Right." He stood up and made some comments about family members who don't live up to expectations and people who embarrass the family name. Everyone started looking at the woman at table 12, and the comments escalated from there. I felt a familiar anger building in my chest. The same pattern I'd experienced now being directed at Elena. Jessica, I need you to do something for me. Go to the head table and ask if there are any issues with the service or the venue that need my attention. Your attention specifically? Tell them the venue owner needs to address any problems personally. Should I mention that you're? Just say the owner wants to ensure all guests are comfortable. 10 minutes later, I watched from my office as Jessica approached the head table. I saw her speak briefly with my father, who looked surprised by the inquiry. She gestured toward table 12, and I could see him shake his head dismissively, probably claiming there were no problems. But Jessica persisted, explaining that the venue owner insisted on personally addressing any guest concerns. After a brief conversation, I saw my father reluctantly stand up and follow her toward table 12. That was my cue. I took the elevator down to the main floor and entered the ballroom just as Jessica was leading my father across the room. The ambient noise of conversation and celebration continued, but I could sense the undercurrent of tension surrounding Elena's table. As I approached, I could hear the tail end of a conversation that made my blood boil. Simply can't keep accommodating family members who don't meet our standards, my father was saying to Jessica. This is a milestone celebration, and we can't have people here who might embarrass us in front of our friends. Elena sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, looking like she wanted to disappear. Dad, I heard my brother Carlos add, maybe it's time to be honest about expectations. Not everyone in this family is going to be successful, and we shouldn't have to pretend otherwise at important events. My Aunt Rosa nodded in agreement. It's not fair to the family members who have worked hard to achieve something. Why should we have to include people who bring down the tone? I stepped into their field of vision. Excuse me, I said calmly, I'm the venue owner. I understand there's a problem with my establishment. The conversation stopped abruptly. My father looked at me with confusion, not immediately recognizing me in my professional attire. There's no problem with the venue, he said carefully. We're just having a family discussion. I see. And this family discussion involves excluding one of your guests from the celebration. That's a private family matter, Carlos began. Actually, it becomes a venue matter when it affects the comfort and safety of all our guests, I interrupted. We have a strict policy against harassment of any kind. My father's eyes narrowed as recognition began to dawn. Wait a minute. You look familiar. Do I? I kept my voice professionally neutral. Elena looked up at me for the first time and I could see tears in her eyes. She clearly had no idea who I was, but she seemed grateful that someone was finally intervening on her behalf. What exactly is the nature of this family discussion? I continued. Look, Aunt Rosa stepped forward. We're trying to handle a delicate situation. This is a high-class event and we have certain standards. What standards would those be? Well, a dress code, social expectations, the ability to contribute appropriately to family occasions. I see. And this young woman has failed to meet these standards. How exactly? Carlos gestured dismissively toward Elena. She's a teacher. She works at a public school. She can't afford to participate in family events at this level, and frankly, it's awkward for everyone when she tries. It's not personal, my father added, though his tone suggested otherwise. It's just that family celebrations should be for family members who have achieved something meaningful. And teaching children isn't meaningful? Of course it is, but let's be realistic about income levels and social compatibility. I'm sorry, I interrupted, my professional composure beginning to crack. But did you just suggest that someone's value to your family is determined by their income level? That's not what we're saying, Aunt Rosa began. That's exactly what you're saying. You're telling me that you've excluded this woman from your family celebration because she doesn't make enough money to meet your social standards. My father stepped closer, studying my face more carefully. Who are you exactly? And why are you inserting yourself into a private family matter? I'm the owner of this establishment, and I'm responsible for ensuring that all guests are treated with dignity and respect on my property. Your property? Carlos laughed. Come on. You're probably just a manager or something. I pulled out my business card and handed it to my father. Martinez Hospitality Group, LLC. I own this venue, along with 6 others in the metropolitan area. My father stared at the card, then at me, then back at the card. Martinez, he said slowly. Your last name is Martinez. Yes. And you own this place? Among others. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. His face went white as he realized he was standing in front of his daughter, the daughter he'd publicly disowned for being a financial failure, at the venue she owned. Sophia, he whispered. Hello, Dad. The word Dad rippled through the nearby tables like an electric shock. Family members who had been engaged in their own conversations suddenly turned to stare. The ambient party noise seemed to decrease as more people became aware of the drama unfolding. Sophia, how are you own this place? I own this place. I've owned it for 4 years. Carlos stepped forward, his face flushed with confusion and embarrassment. That's impossible. You work some dead-end office job. You couldn't even lend me money for my restaurant. I work as the CEO of a hospitality company that I built from the ground up. And I didn't lend you money because your business plan was fundamentally flawed, not because I couldn't afford to. But you live in that small apartment, you drive that old car. I choose to live modestly. It's called financial responsibility. Aunt Rosa was staring at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Sophia, you've been successful? This whole time. Very successful. My company's portfolio is worth approximately $67 million. The number hit the group like a bomb. I could see family members at nearby tables straining to hear the conversation. 67 million? My father repeated faintly. Yes. This venue alone generates over 2 million annually. But we thought, you never said. You never asked. You assumed I was a failure because I didn't live extravagantly or boast about my achievements. Elena was watching this exchange with wide eyes, clearly realizing that the family outcast had turned out to be more successful than anyone had imagined. Sophia, Carlos said desperately, if we had known, you would have treated me differently? That's exactly the problem. But family should support each other. Should they? Because 3 years ago at Maria's wedding, you told everyone that I was too selfish to help family. You said I was an embarrassment who couldn't even afford to contribute to family events. My father winced at the memory. Sophia, I was angry about the loan situation. You were angry because I refused to enable Carlos's poor financial decisions. And instead of respecting my judgment, you decided I was the problem. We made mistakes. You made choices. You chose to judge me based on your assumptions about my financial status. You chose to exclude me from family events because you thought I wasn't successful enough to belong. I turned to Elena, who was still sitting quietly at her isolated table. Elena, right? You're Roberto's daughter. She nodded, looking uncertain. What do you teach? 3rd grade, she said quietly. That's wonderful. Some of my most meaningful memories are from 3rd grade. My teacher, Mrs. Patterson, made me feel like I could accomplish anything. Elena smiled for the first time that evening. Elena, I continued, I want you to know that the behavior you've experienced tonight is not acceptable in my venue. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their career or income level. I turned back to my family. As the owner of this establishment, I have a decision to make. I can either allow this celebration to continue under the current circumstances, or I can ask you to leave. Sophia, please, my father began. Here are my conditions. Elena is welcome to join any table she chooses, and she will be treated with the same respect as every other family member. The derogatory comments about her career, her income, and her contribution to the family stop immediately. Of course, absolutely, Aunt Rosa said quickly. And, I continued, I want a sincere public apology to Elena for the treatment she's received tonight. My father looked around the ballroom, realizing that dozens of family members and friends were now watching the drama unfold. Sophia, couldn't we discuss this privately? Elena was humiliated publicly. The apology will be public. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Finally, my father stepped forward and addressed Elena directly. Elena, I owe you a sincere apology. What happened tonight was wrong. You are a valued member of this family, and your career as a teacher is something we should all respect and support. Elena nodded graciously, though I could see she was still processing the sudden reversal in her treatment. Carlos followed reluctantly. Elena, I'm sorry for the things I said. Teaching is important work and I was out of line. One by one, the family members at nearby tables offered their own apologies. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted, with everyone suddenly very aware that the family dynamic had been fundamentally altered. Thank you, I said. Now, Elena, would you like to join the head table for the rest of the celebration? Elena looked surprised. I couldn't. Of course you can. There's plenty of room and you deserve to be part of the celebration. As Elena gathered her things and moved to the head table, I prepared to make my own exit. But my father caught my arm. Sophia, please don't leave. Stay for the rest of the party. We have so much to talk about. Do we? Yes. I want to understand everything. Your business, your success, why you kept it secret from us. I didn't keep it secret, Dad. I just didn't advertise it. There's a difference. But why? Why didn't you tell us you were successful? Because I wanted to know who my family really was. I wanted to see how you'd treat me without the influence of my money. And what did you learn? I looked around the ballroom at the family members who were now eager to reconnect, at Elena who was finally being welcomed at the head table, at the celebration that had been transformed by a revelation of hidden success. I learned that respect shouldn't be conditional on wealth. I learned that family love shouldn't depend on professional achievement. And I learned that some people only value you for what you can do for them. Sophia, we love you. Do you love me or do you love my portfolio? He didn't have an immediate answer. Dad, here's what I want you to understand. For the past 3 years, you've had a daughter who owned multiple successful businesses, who could have helped with family financial problems, who could have provided job opportunities and business advice. But you never knew that because you decided I wasn't worth your time or respect. We can fix this. Can we? Because right now you're interested in reconciliation because you learned I'm wealthy. If I were still the failure you thought I was, would you be asking me to stay? The question hung in the air between us. I need to think about that, he said finally. I appreciate your honesty. I started to leave, but Elena approached me before I reached the exit. Sophia, thank you for standing up for me, for changing the situation, for everything. Elena, can I give you some advice? Please. Don't let anyone convince you that your worth is determined by your salary. Teaching is one of the most important professions in the world, and anyone who doesn't recognize that isn't someone whose opinion should matter to you. Do you really mean that? Absolutely. In fact, if you're ever interested in expanding your career options, my company is always looking for people with strong educational backgrounds. We run training programs for hospitality staff, and we could use someone with your expertise in curriculum development. Really? Really? Here's my card. Call me next week if you'd like to discuss it. As I finally left the ballroom, I could hear the celebration resuming behind me, but with a notably different energy. The cruel exclusion had been replaced by awkward inclusion, and Elena was now surrounded by family members eager to make up for their earlier behavior. But I knew the real test would come later, when the shock wore off and people had time to process what they'd learned. Over the following weeks, my phone rang constantly. Family members who hadn't contacted me in years were suddenly eager to reconnect. The conversations followed a predictable pattern. Expressions of amazement about my success, apologies for past treatment, and subtle or not so subtle requests for loans, investments, or business opportunities. Carlos called 5 times in 3 days, each time with a new, amazing business opportunity that just needed some initial funding. Aunt Rosa wanted to discuss a real estate investment. My cousin Miguel thought I might be interested in backing his tech startup. The most persistent contact came from my father himself. He called daily, sent letters, and even showed up at my corporate office twice, insisting that we needed to rebuild our relationship. But the conversation that meant the most came from Elena. Sophia, I wanted to thank you again for what you did at the anniversary party. You don't need to thank me, Elena. I did what anyone should do when they see someone being treated unfairly. I also wanted to let you know that I'm interested in that job opportunity you mentioned. That's wonderful. Can you come in for an interview next week? Yes, but I have to ask you something first. Of course. If I work for your company, will that change how you see me? Will I become just another family member trying to benefit from your success? The question was so perceptive it took me by surprise. Elena, you asked to interview based on your qualifications, not on your family connection. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. And if I'm not qualified for the position, then we'll find another way for you to get the experience and training you need. But Elena, you're already qualified for the most important part of the job, treating people with dignity and respect. Elena did interview for the position and she was indeed qualified. She joined my company as our Director of Training and Development, where she's been instrumental in creating programs that focus on both professional excellence and human dignity. As for the rest of my family, the relationships have evolved in different ways. Some, like Elena, have proven their character through consistent actions rather than words. Others have shown that their interest in me remains primarily financial. My father and I have had several long conversations about respect, assumptions, and the true meaning of family success. He's acknowledged his mistakes and has made genuine efforts to change his perspective on wealth and worth. But the most important change has been in how I see myself and my obligations to family. I've learned that love and respect can't be bought with money, and they can't be earned through financial success alone. I still own the Riverside Ballroom and I still host family events there occasionally. But now they're smaller gatherings focused on people who value each other for reasons that have nothing to do with bank accounts or business portfolios. The venue has become profitable beyond my initial projections, partly because of its reputation for treating all guests with dignity regardless of their perceived social status. Word spread about the inclusive hospitality approach, and we've attracted clients who specifically want venues that prioritize respect over prestige. Sometimes, when I'm in my office overlooking the ballroom, I think about that anniversary party and the moment when everything changed. Not when my family learned about my wealth, but when they learned about the consequences of judging people based on assumptions. Because the real lesson wasn't about hidden success or financial revelations. It was about the difference between conditional and unconditional love, and the price we pay when we confuse the two. The venue is still booked solid, the family relationships that matter have been rebuilt on stronger foundations, and Elena has become not just a valued employee but a genuine friend who reminds me daily that success isn't measured in dollars. But most importantly, I never again have to wonder whether my family loves me for who I am or for what I can provide. Because now I know the answer and I've surrounded myself only with the people who give the right one.